Duncan Smith, have you green fingers?
Kind of, yeah. I'm certainly a nature lover. I'm a committed angler, and I have, like many deputies, like many people throughout the country, have seen the silver lining in this pandemic by enjoying nature and being allowed to enjoy nature more than we usually are. Minister, I'm going to front load my contribution with some questions and then make a comment, and then anything you don't get to reply to, I'd appreciate a reply in writing. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan is reaching the end of its natural life. It's been a 5-year plan from 2015 to 2020, and my own assessment is that, like Deputy Noonan, is that it has been a successful plan, and where I believe it's been successful in that it has won the hearts and minds of people in relation to pollinators and in relation to raising awareness. I remember 8-9 years ago, our local authority brought in a wild meadow policy, and it was deeply unpopular. People in the States felt that it was just an excuse not to cut the grass because the hearts and minds hadn't been won. Now, when we go around canvassing and meeting people, we see grass verges have been appropriated for wildflower meadows or little wildflower stretches, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful success. So my question in relation to that, Minister, is for the next All-Ireland Pollinator Plan 2021-2025, is there any specific measures you plan on bringing in, or your department plan on bringing in, that's going to improve the plan for those 5 years? My next question is in relation to the destruction of hedgerows, Minister. It's happening up and down the country in almost every county. It can happen on a relatively large scale, or it can happen on a small scale. Each occurrence of it, be it inside nesting season or outside nesting season, is a disaster for biodiversity and nature. So I just want to ask you, Minister, specifically, are you satisfied with the detection rates of hedgerow destruction, and are you satisfied with the prosecution rates against these crimes? I know the National Parks and Wildlife Services are really working hard to combat this, and I commend them on that element of their work, and it's a difficult job, but it's something I'd appreciate a comment on. And look, it was raised last week, Minister, and I just want to raise it again. In relation to the recent reporting of the raptor deaths, the buzzard deaths in Tibaleague, which occurred in December, which we were only made aware of, look, this is only the latest incident that we've had up and down, predominantly, well, it's happened in Wicklow, but it happens up and down the west coast, from Donegal right down to Cork in particular, where our birds of prey and our raptors are being targeted. And the majesty of these birds and what they bring in tourism, what they bring to the variety of our nature offering cannot be quantified. So, it almost hurts more when you see this happening. It's an awful crime against nature. So my call to you, my ask of you is, do you support what conservationists are asking for and calling for in terms of the setting up of a wildlife crimes unit? And if you don't, do you have a better idea or another idea of how to tackle these crimes that are taking place? Because there really is very few crimes against nature that are more wounding than seeing the deliberate poisoning of our birds of prey and our raptors. And just to say yesterday, Minister, my final question is in relation to the EU biodiversity strategy, which was published yesterday. Now, I know it was only published yesterday, you probably haven't had a chance to digest it, but there's some interesting elements in it. There's a proposal within that strategy that's calling for a third of nature protection sites to be strictly protected. Now, we're interpreting that as having no human activity at all. So, particularly in relation to beaches or elements of bogland that are open to the public at the moment and that the public respect and use appropriately, would this preclude people from using parts of our beaches and that kind of land if this strategy was implemented, such as we're reading it? And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And just finally, Minister, I just want to make a comment. The National Parks and Wildlife do a very good job, and they have a very tough job in protecting wildlife and biodiversity. And it's a battle they're fighting on a local and on a national and on a global, fighting against these local, national and global environmental trends. But I do need to acknowledge this, and I just want to put this as a matter of record. They aren't always right, and they aren't always correct, and they don't always make the correct decisions. And in relation to coastal erosion in the borough in Portrane, the NPWS would not listen to local people. They'd not listen to local public representatives. They'd not listen to independent experts. When we all said that we needed coastal protection measures to protect the dunes, to protect the very habitat that the NPWS wanted to preserve, that we needed coastal protection measures. We lost many, many years in our fight against coastal protection down in the borough of Portrane. Because of the MPWS's intransigence, their rigidity, their inability to communicate effectively, not only with public representatives and local people, but with the local authority, those dunes are now gone. Property has fallen into the sea. Homes continue to be threatened. Local businesses are on the verge of also falling into the sea. Local amenities, important amenities like public toilets, are only centimetres away from being destroyed. And measures are now being put in place, but those lost years we'll never get back. And it was thanks, I must say, to the proactive nature of Minister Boxer-Moran, who visited the site a couple of years ago, that he managed to get the various stakeholders on board, including the MPWS, but it was too slow. It continues to be too slow, and those years are gone. And Minister, I hope you hear this message clearly and you hear the intent with which it is given. Whilst I do acknowledge, and I have acknowledged in terms of hedgerow destruction, the great job that the MPWS do, their job in protecting wildlife and in protecting habitats and ultimately protecting the community in Portrane, they failed ultimately. And that habitat, those terns that were nesting there for which they were protected, are now gone because they've nowhere left to nest. The community is vulnerable, more properties are going to go, and Minister, I think it's important that you are cognizant of that and that the message goes back clearly to the MPWS that sometimes it's important to listen to the community, listen to their representatives and listen to independent experts. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister.
I'll try and cover all of your questions. In relation to the coastal protection measures in Portrane, these have been enabled by the National Parks and Wildlife Service, so you're not correct with respect in relation to that. And the agency with prime responsibility here is Fingal County Council. You may be aware of that. The National Parks and Wildlife Service actually responded within weeks to the temporary sea beam protections put in. I mean, the thing from an sea protective natural erosion takes place, and it wouldn't be appropriate to put in protective structures in place when you're talking about them, but that's perhaps slightly different. In terms of the EU biodiversity strategy, yes, you're correct. It was only released yesterday, and it's very much to be welcomed. In fact, Minister Booton and I will be having a meeting next week with the German Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister, Dr. Maria Flaxbarth, in particular in relation to the contents of it, in advance of the German presidency of the European Council. So it's a good opportunity that we'll have next week to discuss it in more detail. Also, you raised the National Pollinator Plan. That's not just my department, it's a cross-agency initiative, as you're probably aware, but I take on board some of the points that you've made. Obviously, animal pollination plays a vital role as a regulating ecosystems service in nature. But I think we can always look at enhancing and bettering plans that we have already in existence. You mentioned as well about the buzzards, which obviously it was a shocking incident that happened in Cork. I'm not know if you're speaking in general terms, but I mean I did do an interview on RT1 on Morning Ireland specifically in relation to this incident, and also about answering whether we need a wildlife crime unit. And we have a wildlife crime unit in the department, which is headed up by Principal Officer John Fitzgerald. And there is very strong legislation, I think, in my view, in relation to wildlife. Like Section 74 of the Wildlife Act, one of the penalties on summary conviction is a 6-month imprisonment. And there's a fine not exceeding 100,000 if it's on conviction or indictment, or a 2-year imprisonment, or both. So, I'm not sure if you could go any further in relation to that. And we have had a number of different prosecutions over the last number of years for poisoning. We had the grey heron in County Louth, which was the last one in 2016, but there was also one in 2014 where there were 2 defendants who were poisoning birds in quarries in Waterford, and they were fined €8,000. And in fairness to the National Parks and Wildlife Service, they do a huge amount of work with An Garda Síochána. We have a memorandum of understanding there as well. And the raptor, our bird of prey, is actually one of the success stories that we have in Ireland. You also mentioned, I think it was about hedges, I think about cutting hedges. You know, the Wildlife Acts dictate when hedge cutting can take place, which is September to February, and the Minister doesn't have any discretion in that. But roadside hedge cutting is always going to be allowed for safety reasons and safety purposes. Other hedge cutting is allowed for agricultural and forestry purposes.